The Weald Foundation is a charitable trust that was established in 2003. Its primary objective is to preserve and restore historically significant military vehicles and equipment, especially those from the First and Second World War. Its mission is to educate the public about the history of these vehicles and their role in military conflicts. The Weald Foundation's collection is a rare and unique assembly of working vehicles, both armoured and soft-skinned, and is regarded as one of the finest collections of its kind in the world. As a charitable trust, it is committed to the ongoing maintenance and preservation of these important vehicles in order to educate future generations.
We don't have long on this earth, and all we can do within that time is actually ensure that we make a mark in some way. And you put that into the realm of the Weald Foundation. We want to make a mark so that people would think of the Weald Foundation as being a center of excellence, striving for absolute authenticity, absolute accuracy. To my mind, the biggest bang for our buck as an organization is what does something look like when it leaves the assembly hall, when it leaves our workshops, when the public actually see it. Good afternoon, Hilary.
Yes,
thank
indeed.
you very much for agreeing to another vehicle, one of our vehicle discussions. And this particular one is all about the Marmon Herrington, or the South African Reconnaissance car. And starting off with, obviously, the forerunners of our Mark III that we're talking today about, the Mark I and Mark II.
Well, it's very exciting to talk about these cars because they are such historically important vehicles, and they need to be understood more by the general people who are interested in armoured vehicles.
This obviously is a car which is exceedingly close to many South Africans' hearts, given its history. The two armoured cars that Britain had at the time were two exceedingly underwhelming armoured cars. One was in the form of the Morris armoured car with a weird-shaped body, and then the other one was the Daimler armoured car, which was obviously a lot more sophisticated than the Morris. The South Africans contacted Britain at the time and asked whether or not they could actually have the plans with which to obviously build onto these Ford truck chassis that they were looking at the time in order to develop armoured cars in South Africa. The British did not want to provide the South Africans with the building instructions, the drawings or anything else. And so South Africa then were thrown into the deep end. But luckily at that stage had not been standing still and came up with a project as impressive as that of the Indians and the Australians, if I might say, albeit a little bit bigger.
Basically, the Mark I defined and explored the shape of the vehicle, and then the Mark II is simply that they had managed to make the negotiations and contract for receiving those front axles from Marmon Herrington. And Marmon Herrington in the States was a company that had made its name turning standard Ford trucks for construction firms, turning them from a two-wheel drive, because Ford didn't bother with the four-wheel drives, but Marmon Herrington were supplying kits to the construction industry so that they could convert their two-wheel drive trucks into four-wheel drive, and typically for tipper use and so forth on construction sites. You have to look at these vehicles at their time. I mean, in the second half of 1940 and the first quarter of 1941, these were the only armoured cars available
That's true.
The problem was that all the equipment got sent over to France and Belgium in 39-40. Every single bit, virtually, except a few small items that were kept within England and so forth for training. And when Dunkirk came and they got cut off, everything was lost.
Yes, and there was a huge demand for these brand new armoured cars for the British Army. So do you remember the training tool which we managed to get from South Africa, which we were hugely impressed by? This is actually a training aid, a training model, as used by the armoured car units, or in the training of the armoured car units, and those were obviously built up pretty quickly. They were used to describe or show people what formations to actually move in.
Ah, right, okay, yes.
And how to utilize these cars in formation.
Yeah.
Under which circumstances. Right, this is a very, very interesting item I actually managed to secure from South Africa. So they would use these in their numbers to obviously help with different formations. But this would have been enough to be able to show the troops that were being trained exactly how to operate, not drive, but how to position themselves for their particular unit in a given situation. Now, what other things that are interesting about this is the camouflage, which has been applied to this. Now, this is what you would call the Contour scheme. More interestingly than that is the actual paint that's been used. That actually provided us with a pretty welcome key as to what the paints were, because we tested these paints against known paints that we have from the time of South African reconnaissance cars, and they matched. So this is a very, very interesting artifact for all of those reasons. But think of how you would get a training aid all those years later turn up here in Kent. That is just fantastic. Each completed armoured car was sent out on a fairly extensive and rigorous test and questions that had to be answered all the way through.
Yeah.
And it was only when that had been completed and successfully completed were these things then accepted as operational vehicles. And only then were they painted.
Yeah, that's interesting, all right. Yeah, well, I mean, we mustn't forget that all motor vehicles of that period and up into the, I would say up to the mid-60s, maybe even longer, a car had to be run in. So when an owner got a vehicle delivered, the first 600-700 miles driving was meant to be done at a slower pace, and there was oil changes and so forth to bed the engine in and so forth. It's only in modern times that you can buy a new vehicle from the forecourt and effectively drive it flat out from day one. But these vehicles in those days required extensive running in, and you don't want to give that task to the troops, because in all countries there was a problem with people driving. They didn't have the experience.
If the production of the Mark I and the Mark II were, let's say, almost happening at the same time, is there something that distinguishes a Mark I from a Mark II comprehensively?
One really only has to look at the front axle, and if the front axle is visible on a Mark I, it's just a cross beam. A normal truck axle. On a Mark II, it's got the big differential of the Marmon Herrington front wheel drive. So it didn't have a four-wheel drive capability at all, the Mark I. The Mark I, no. Never. It was a rear-wheel drive. It was obviously would be quite adequate for patrolling airports or roads and stuff like that, but it wasn't what was going to be needed for any sort of battlefield activity.
And there was something about it overheating as well.
Yes, well, I think early on in the first initial, I don't know whether there was an actual series or not, but about 15 or 20 vehicles were manufactured. Number one, they were riveted, but also they had this. They had the headlights built into the fenders, and the whole airflow system wasn't as well developed as it was later on.
Because they were saying for over one day, each armoured car would actually consume up to 183 litres of water.
Yeah.
That's spectacular. But that's in line with, obviously, where all the testing came in and everything else, because there was quite a rigorous testing procedure, was there not?
Yes, obviously very, very good testing and so forth. But obviously that amount of water is ridiculous. You wouldn't expect a vehicle to have to use that amount of water per day. A litre or two would be acceptable to be topped up in the evening time. But that 180 litres, that means you have to top it up every few miles.
But they did. With those Mark 1s, and where the Mark 1s obviously went into action, as they did, as many of them did, they were in, where did they start off? They went up, there was an engagement in Madagascar, from my understanding.
Yes, Madagascar and in East Africa.
All the way up through East Africa, chasing the
Italians.
The Italians, yes. I was going to use my grandfather's expression, but that wouldn't have been very good to use in this. What we've done now is a lot more theoretical, because the only Mark 1 and 2 that I've ever seen, I believe, is in Johannesburg.
Yeah, there's one of the very early Mark 1s in Johannesburg. Yes.
There isn't a Mark 2, is there? So there is a Mark.
No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody's come up with the Mark 2 yet.
Yeah.
But you never know, one could show up. I mean, there's various pictures of the woods in Greece with one lying there and so forth. But I presume, like everything else, its scrap value was serious, so people would have broken it up and brought it down to the scrapyard and got their 10 bob for a pound of steel.
All right, so well, listen, thank you very much, and we will talk soon.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye.